Hey, Steve Moran here with another episode of Foresight TV. I am talking to my friend Beth Mace, who is the chief economist for NIC. I don't know whether it's for better or worse, Beth, but I promise you this will not be as insane as last week's episode where Jack York played me. And Michael Owens was his sidekick, and it was absolute insanity. I would really recommend you watch it. I will confess that I didn't watch it for like 4 days afterwards, Beth, because I was scared to death of what they were going to do and how bad it was. But
well, hopefully we'll see if we can do that better then.
Yeah, we'll do better here. So, but before we get started, let me play this.
Hey guys, Steve Moran here.
Bravo, that's a great intro.
I love that intro. We've been using it for about a year now, and it makes me smile every time I watch it. And it's even got my glasses crooked. I keep thinking I should go fix that, but anyway, that's part of the look now. So, Beth, you probably understand the occupancy and the data and the economy of senior living better than anybody else in the whole world, which is really cool.
Well, thank you.
And so I'm really excited to be able to have you on here, and NIC Map Vision, make sure I got that right, releases quarterly data about occupancy and other things. And so can you just kind of, and you had a new release, I guess 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago now?
About a week ago, yep.
Yeah. And so once it came out, way it connected, I really wanted to get out and sort of talk about those. So can you just, let's start by why don't you kind of walk us through an overview of what those numbers look like, and then we'll dig a little deeper into them.
Yeah, sure. So we collect data, just so people understand, at the property level, then we aggregate it up and we report it at various levels of geographies. And the most common level that we reported is what we call our primary markets, and that's the 31 largest metropolitan areas in the United States. So we're collecting information, and we release it generally on a quarterly basis. We also have an intra-quarterly, like almost a monthly time series, but let's focus on the quarterly one today. And in the first quarter of 22, we saw that the occupancy rate for senior housing increased by 0.2 percentage points to 80.6%. Seniors housing in this context is assisted living and independent living together. So we saw that increase of 0.2 percentage points. It was less than what we saw in the second half of 2021, but I actually was pretty encouraged by it because we saw an increase in occupancy despite very contagious Omicron. And it speaks to the success of the vaccines, as well as to the success of operators and their ability to control infections at their properties. So if you recall, the level of infection from Omicron was significantly worse than even at the beginning of COVID. And we remember what happened at that point when there was such a plunge in occupancy rates. And so this quarter, while it was, again, less than what we've seen in the second half of last year, I was actually encouraged by that we're sort of we're able to protect our residents and take care of residents. And we saw an occupancy increase.
Yeah. So first off, I think there's no question that the industry has done a terrific job of figuring out how to protect residents and staff. Where we've gone in, we've dug in, we figured it out, and it's a ton better. We're not seeing the levels of infection. We're not seeing the levels of death. Certainly, the vaccine's a big part of that, but I think that just better practices and controls for me though, I found it's interesting your perspective on it, because I was a little surprised. I guess I thought the numbers would be bigger, but I also know that we're talking about a few months ago, so there's some lag time there. And it seems like, as I've talked to operators, that they sort of, as we were coming out, even with Omicron, they saw sort of an initial jump, and then it sort of flattened out, and there's been some disappointment there. Do you have any thoughts on that? So would you expect it to, like, it's going to be amazing this next quarter?
So we really bottomed out or hit the low point in the first quarter of 2021. So 4 quarters, 1 year after Omicron really started. And since then, we have seen, in the case of seniors housing, about a 2.5 percentage point increase in occupancies. So the overall rate again in the first quarter of 22 was 80.6%. At its low point, it had been 78%. So we're on the right path. Now that said, pre-COVID, we were at an occupancy rate of about 87.2. And what that means is that we still have another nearly 7 percentage points, or 6.7 percentage points exactly, to get back to that level of occupancy that we saw prior to beginning of COVID. So, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll continue to see occupancy come back. But there's a dynamic going on here at the same time that we're seeing demand come back. Some of that was pent up. So we saw a really strong behavior in the second half of 2021, like record levels of demand in the third and fourth quarters of last year. And I'm not sure we'll reach those levels again, but I think we're in the right direction of increasing demand and increasing absorption, or what I call absorption, the change in occupied units. At the same time, though, you have to keep in mind that there's inventory growth that's occurred. And there was inventory growth that occurred through, even during COVID, right? There were a lot of projects that had been started that opened. And so we're seeing that impact.
Yeah. So one of the things that I saw in the report, I can't remember whether the report or the press release, but you talked about units that had been vacated and then reoccupied since then. And can you talk a little bit about those numbers?
Yeah, so if you look at overall, we lost for senior housing again in the primary markets. We lost about 42,000 units. Of those units for seniors housing, we've seen 59% of those units have been reoccupied, so to speak. When I break it down again, senior housing is assisted living and independent living. When I look at assisted living, 71% of those units have been reoccupied. And for independent living, it's about 43%. So focusing again just on assisted living for a second, that's 3 of every 4 units that were vacated or put back into the market have been retaken up or reabsorbed. The occupancy rate doesn't show that same improvement because the occupancy rate is a function of 2 things. It's a function of demand and supply. So during that same time, while we saw the growth in inventory slow from some historic levels prior to that, there still was inventory that came into the market. So you can almost think of it as 3 buckets that have to get filled, right? The units that came back into the market. So as people didn't move in or the people vacated those units, as bucket 1. Bucket 2 would be the new product that came into the market during the COVID period. And then bucket 3 would be the product that is currently being developed. So it's just not a matter of reabsorbing or taking up those units that were placed back in the market. You also have to take into account the new inventory.
So yeah, so there's a lot to fill up. I have a question that came up. I'm actually going to pop it up on the screen because I think this is a great question to ask. Do you feel the vaccination status, caregivers mandated vaccine carries any weight in regard to occupancy?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I suppose from a positive point of view, we know that most residents have been vaccinated, right?
Right.
We know that not all staff have been vaccinated. I have the numbers. I could look it up for you in a minute if you want. But in terms, it's not as high a percentage of staff that have been vaccinated. But in those properties where there have been either mandated staff vaccinations, that certainly helps to support demand from residents and from family members. A family member wants to feel good that they're putting their parent in a safe environment.
So I don't know whether you have the data, but really, so I'll try the ad question and see if you have it or not. Do you have any sense of whether or not the communities where they're requiring their staff to be vaccinated have higher occupancy than the ones where it's optional?
I don't have any hard data, but I do know the operators that were mandating vaccines early on did see the improvement in their occupancy rates anecdotally faster because people just felt safer.
Yeah. And I guess so. The other question I'm sort of wondering about in terms of occupancy is, do you have any sense, and again, you maybe even have data on this, but do you have any sense that part of the reluctance, part of the lack of more robust occupancy growth is because isolation challenges, either regulatory or because of policy about the community, so that if all of a sudden I'm living in a community and we get an infection, then my life becomes substantially constricted?
Well, again, I don't have hard data on this, but I do have some anecdotes. They're almost the opposite.
Okay.
So that people are moving into properties, especially independent living, because of the socialization aspects of it. So they don't want to be isolated. They don't want to be alone. So they're viewing moving into more of a congregate setting as a way to prevent that isolation. So, and I've heard that from a number of operators that they're, again, independent living is being helped and supported by the idea that there is a social environment. There's people you can interact with every day. And again, people were tired of being at home and lonely, honestly.
And yet your data shows that independent living what actually lost ground. I mean, it was tiny, like 0.1%, right?
Yeah, so I wouldn't overreact so much to that little percentage point.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it means nothing changed, sort of, right?
Right. So, but it is one stat I wanted to share with you, which I think you'll find really interesting, is the distribution of those occupancy rates. So,
Okay.
for example, for seniors housing, 30% of those properties have occupancy rates above 90%. 30% above 90%.
Wow.
So that average that we use at 80.6 is an average. So there's going to be some that are much higher, some that are much lower. So the flip side, so 30% above 90, but the flip side is about 40% are below 80. And then when I look at that by market, the most occupied market in the first quarter was Boston, and the least occupied market was Cleveland. So within Boston, there were 21% of properties with occupancies above 95%.
Wow.
In San Jose, 20% of properties above 95%. Now, again, Cleveland, least less occupied, there were 10% of properties that had occupancies above 95%. And then if you do the reverse, and I'm trying to just throw numbers at you, but if you do the reverse, in Cleveland, about 49% of properties were below 80% occupied, compared with San Jose of 28%. So the averages, are obscuring some of the detail here, that even during the height of the pandemic, there are a number of markets, a number of properties that still maintain over 95% occupancies. And we've traced those properties, and some properties the whole time still maintain that.
So do you have any sense at all as to what those properties were doing differently to get there? I mean, I in some sense, from an operator standpoint, I'm thinking, if I'm listening to that, is I want to figure out what they're doing so I can go do that.
Yeah, well, a lot of them were, I would say, best-in-class operators with best-in-class locations, best-in-class markets. Typically they had pretty good relationships with their capital partners too, both their equity partners and their debt partners. So there might have been, a little bit of relief that was given. There might have been some financial support that was given. They probably directly, tried to isolate as quickly as they can, and they kept their residents as safe as they can. And some of it, honestly, was luck, because we know that if you go back and remember back to then, we know that the root of Omicron in COVID in some cases really was a function of the geography I lived in, because it came into properties from, if it was a heavy concentration, and remember initially in New Jersey or New York, you were sort of a sitting duck in the sense that you couldn't totally protect. So some of it was just luck that it didn't sort of hit your property because you were in the right place at the right time. Yeah.
And the one thing I guess I would say is, I'm listening to you talk about these numbers, I sort of think they're if I'm an operator, or really anybody who's involved in the ownership of a building, there are kind of two ways to look at this number, right? If you're not in that 95 or that plus 95, it could feel sort of depressing. But for me, what I look at that and think, man, if you're one of those guys who's way down there and you're watching this today, that's opportunity. That means that you could be there, and it might retooling might require some hard conversations with your capital partners. But, I think that you have this opportunity to get there, and that's pretty cool.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
I really like that. So at the NIC conference in Dallas a few weeks ago, you issued a caution,
I did.
and I would like to talk about that.
Yeah, it's been a little controversial, I might add.
What's that?
It's been a little controversial by some, I might add.
I am sure that's true. I am sure that's true. I'm sure that's true. We love controversy here, so that's good.
Well, what I said is that even though inventory growth is slow, and I'll give you some numbers in a minute, we can't be lazy and just assume that the markets are going to be there. And I've been involved in this industry for a very long time, and I've been involved in the investment side of this industry for almost 20 years. So I think it's always good to send a warning shot to developers who are always optimistic by definition and by nature about new construction activity, and that it's important to really roll up your sleeves and understand a market and pay attention to what land is entitled, what land could be competitive in terms of senior housing, what the development landscape is like. And we're at a pause right now. That this inventory growth has slowed, starts has slowed, they're starting to pick up again. Construction activity has slowed down. But nevertheless, there are some markets that are still challenged. So for example, in the data that we just released shows that in Miami and Portland, Oregon. So in Miami, I'm looking at this as a construction as a share of inventory. And what that is, if I just told you there were like 10 units under construction, you wouldn't have any context. Is that a lot? Is that a little? So to normalize that, we look at construction as a share of the overall inventory in the market. And in the case of Miami, construction as a share of inventory in the first quarter was about 11%. So that's a high. That's the highest, second highest it's ever been. And in Portland, it's about 9%, and that's at an all-time high. So it doesn't mean this is bad. I actually favor new development as long as it's measured. Because we want new product, we want new offerings. You know, NIC's whole mission is access and choice for senior housing and care options. So new is good, especially that we need new designs of architecture and engineering, but it has to be in measured ways, and it has to make sure that it doesn't overshoot demand growth. And Atlanta is a market that often gets beat up because it's always got relatively low occupancy rates. And if you looked at the demand side of Atlanta alone, it's very strong. It's among the strongest markets. And why is that? It's partly because people continue to migrate into Atlanta. Businesses grow in Atlanta. Families, employers come to Atlanta for that. And often adult children bring their parents. So that's all good. Very strong demand market. But it's fairly easy to develop in Atlanta. So what happens is development always overshoots. And so that puts downward pressure on the occupancy rates. So my comment was, based also on anecdotal evidence, I go out and I speak a lot, and I ask how many people are developing, and I see hand after hand after hand go up, and that's what made me nervous more than the data was the intention of people. So I think it's always good to put a cautionary statement out there, and there are certain markets that are fine. There's no development. Sacramento is one that's interesting. That used to be a few years ago. I was like, oh my gosh, Sacramento's like nuts. It's got so much development going on. Well, it did, and now it's got nothing going on. So it's going to take, that's good because it will take a while for the market to absorb all that supply. But it's kind of a cautionary tale, and I would say that for any property type in any location. So there is evidence right now of concerns on my part of excess supply in a couple markets. It's not widespread though.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought up Sacramento because I was going to ask you about it just to make sure, as Beth knows, the reason she brings it up, it's where I live. And I know that like 3 years ago, we had, I can't remember the exact number, but it was like 40 projects that were on the board. And
I have the number. So in 2019, 17% of the inventory was under construction.
Wow.
And that was about 1,800 units, which was a lot for that market to absorb.
Yep.
The occupancy rate came down. And now we're at the point where construction as a share of inventory is about 1%. So that's good. So it will give that market some time to balance and to absorb all that new supply that came into the market. But had it stayed at that clip, that would have put downward pressure. There would have been more competition for everybody, and it would have kept downward pressure on occupancy rates.
Yeah. So I want to shift a little bit. We know, I mean, we numbers this week, right, on inflation. What Talk to me about the impact of inflation on occupancy and margins and all that kind of thing.
Okay, so now you've tipped a topic that I'm keen on. So
Good.
I've been trained as an economist. So I have to say, as an economist, it's been horrible for so many reasons the last several years. From an economist point of view, it's been really, if you can step back and forget the human pain and the suffering that's going on, which is not easy to do, but it's really interesting because there's a lot of textbook examples that you've learned as if you're trained as an economist, you've learned about. Now, inflation is one of those. We had inflation that was, benign for 40 years. With CPI came out this past week. When CPI is a consumer price index, it's looking at the price of consumer goods and how that's changed over the past 12 months. And it was up at 8.5%, which is crazy. So what that means is that your purchasing power has gone down by 8.5% in the last year. A dollar is buying now 93 cents worth of goods that it bought last year, bought a dollar's worth of goods. So there's a couple of reasons that that's happened. One is that certainly the pandemic caused enormous supply chain crises, which caused prices to move up because there simply wasn't the distribution channels and there wasn't the supply that was being, the goods that were being produced. Second, there were those three, you may remember there were those three big stimulus checks that went out to most Americans, $1,200 in April of 2020, $600 in December of 2021, and then another $1,400 in March of 2021. It boosted people's demand because people couldn't go out to shop to eat because all the service restaurants were closed and things like that. They spent it on goods. They spent it on things, TVs and computers and clothes and things like that. So that accelerated demand at a crazy pace. So supply couldn't keep up. Same thing. It all comes down to economic supply and demand. Here we are, supply and demand again. So in this case, demand was too strong. We were just talking about supply being too much for senior housing. In this case, demand was too strong and boosted up prices. So the long and short of it is, this is the first time that our industry has been really facing inflation like this. So this is, again, I said the highest in 40 years. So think about that. A lot of senior housing operators didn't exist 40 years ago. Our industry is really growing in the last 40 years. So this is new. And so how do you deal with it? How do you even put your head around it? So a couple of things. There's probably 4 or 5 influences, at least that I've categorized. One is directly on consumer confidence and the ability and desire of people to wanting to move into our product. So consumer confidence is big. It's a big measure. If you feel good about things, you go forward with things. When you don't feel so good, you don't go so forward. And one of the biggest drivers of that, believe it or not, is gasoline and gasoline prices at the pump. And Americans feel they deserve $2.50 gas no matter what. And as soon as it goes above that, people get really anxious and their confidence starts to wane. So that's indirectly, that could feed into demand for seniors housing. Second, the cost for goods and materials are rising, obviously rising really rapidly. And senior housing operators, they pay for those same goods and services. Food prices are up. Food prices up 8.5% in last year. So that's affecting expenses. That's affecting margins for operators. The fear is that that's going to lead into a wage price spiral. And what that means is that as a consumer, I'm paying 8.5% more for my food. I'm going to go out and I'm going to start to demand higher wages. Well, in fact, if you look at the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistic on wages, in the fourth quarter of 2021, the average hourly earnings rate for seniors, for assisted living employees, was up by 9%. So there's this fear that you'll get this intractable wage price spiral, which we had in the 1970s. And if it doesn't get contained, it can cause havoc. So as a result of that, we're seeing the Federal Reserve increase interest rates a lot in this year, from flat to probably 1.88% by the end of the year, 2.7%, 2.75% by next year. And that's going to affect the cost of borrowing. So that could have an impact on development. It could have an impact on just operating borrowing when you want to go out and you want to finance any type of thing for your project. Higher interest rates, in turn, can affect valuations. And for, I don't know how much your audience will be familiar with cap rates and things like that, but interest rates and cap rates often go in tandem in one direction or the other. And there's fear that cap rates will go up, which would hurt the value of your property. And whether or not that will occur is up for question, because there's also a lot of capital on the sidelines, which would come in. And again, demand and supply. There's a lot of demand from capital providers for the limited amount of transactions. So that might prevent that type of price valuation change that could offset that impact on interest rates. And what happens in terms of the overall pricing and transactions? Does that speed up activity into the early part of this year? If I know interest rates are rising in the next, for sure, in the next 12, 24 months, will that cause me to try to accelerate activity to the beginning of this year rather than waiting for later? So those are some of the ways.
So one of the things that, and I think you asked this question in one of the panels that I was at, and maybe you've done some research on this, but sort of the question has been, we're seeing sort of that either people are raising their rates much more rapidly. But what I'm hearing is, 8 to 13% for residents. And so what impact will that have in terms of just, the affordability? Is it going to have a substantial shrinking of the people who can simply afford?
Yeah, so NIC's data doesn't show that same kind of increase, but we look at asking rate data. And our asking rate data for assisted living for the first quarter 22 showed a 4.1% increase. Keep in mind that there was a Social Security increase for everybody who was on Social Security this year of 5.9% that took effect in January. That pegs off of the CPI from like the September, October period from last year. So depending on that increase of rates, some of that would be sort of a sweep of someone's Social Security increase that would go into that. I mean, the truth is that the costs for operators are going up a lot because of those wages, expenses. Labor counts about 60% of expenses. And a lot of operators I know you've talked about this, using agency help. And so that's caused wages to go up quite dramatically as well. So there are some margins that are being squeezed. My sense is that, people are sensitive to the idea. They're reading it every day about inflation. So they're anticipating that there's going to be some type of rate increase.
So so that's sort of the plus side, is that people are not going to be shocked by the
well, I'm sure nobody likes to pay more, right?
Well, nobody likes to pay more, but they're not. There's not going to be necessarily a shock value. The other question I want to and I warned you in advance I was going to give you this question, and it'd be probably the last one that I will have time for. But there's for the last 10 years, there's been this huge talk of and anticipation of this age wave that's going to kind of solve all things. And when you go look at organizations that own and operate senior living that are in the public sector, where they're having to report earnings and they're struggling and they're trying to paint optimism, you'll often see, we're well positioned for the coming age wave. And I know boomers are still pretty young, but some of them are not so young, and it doesn't seem to be having a big impact yet. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think that you are seeing positive demand, as we talked about the occupancy rate that we're seeing. And yeah, you're all right. People are getting older, but the real big thrust of the baby boomers doesn't still happen for another 6 to 8 years. So the oldest baby boomer in 2022 is 76. Average age for senior housing is 84 to 86, depending on who you talk to, and the property itself. So we still have a ways to go until that really comes. So my bigger concern is, the demand is going to be there, but I like to say, if you build it, will they come? Yeah. So we have to make sure that the product that we're producing is in fact the product that people really want to move into. And baby boomers have never really done anything like their parents. And they're certainly a more fussy group. I'm a baby boomer, I can say, more fussy, more compared to, I always talk about my mother. She was happy with a piece of bread with ketchup. She's a depression girl, and I was fine for. I'm not so sure I'd want that same piece of bread with ketchup. So there's different desires of what people want to have. So I think that our industry really needs to be listening carefully to see what it is and how people want to live with each other. And I know my colleague, I know you talked to Bob Kramer a lot. He's got a big push about purpose and meaning and engagement that older people want as they get older. They don't want to be out and put out in pasture, so to speak. They want to be still involved. So I think we need to keep that in mind as we develop new product.
Yeah. I'm very much in sync with his thinking. I guess the one thing that I'm not quite so sure of, where I may be a little bit of a contrarian, is that I wonder what, when I as a boomer and you as a boomer get to be 85 or 90 and we start facing declining health and cognition. I'm not saying this is true, but I'm not sure. But what we may discover that our needs for some, say, particularly assisted living, are not that much different than prior.
I agree. I mean,
so
yeah, exactly right. I think as I watch my family's aged and stuff, your desires to go out and be, Mr. Involved and Mrs. Involved to wane a little bit, right?
That's
so
right.
I think you're right, but I think as you're moving towards that cohort, we still have to recognize that that it is a different cohort that we're serving, just like a shift from the greatest generation to the generation that's living in product today.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the thing that makes it so much fun and fascinating and exciting and a little bit scary is we actually, even though you and I are boomers, we don't even know what we want, right? So that's we should have some ideas, and it'll evolve, and there'll be some people who are able to evolve and figure it out, and it'll be they'll do an amazing job of serving us older people, and they'll have amazing profits, and some who will sort of struggle. So is there anything I've missed that I should be asking you before about?
Well, I was just thinking as you said that there was people taking care of the baby boomers. So I think we really have to be mindful of the staff and the workers, and I think we really, we hear about staffing shortages all the time, and the more and more I really think about this, the more and more I understand that we really have to have a better communication between the staff and the residents, and the residents and the leadership, and the leadership and the staff. It's like a three-legged stool here, that we have to support each other. And I'm not sure that the communication goes as well among all those groups of people that I talked about. So I really think conversation and listening and respect for one another would really help. I'm not saying it doesn't exist everywhere. I'm just saying when I really think about this, the organizations that are really successful, you have relationships. My mother was in assisted living, and she had some great relationships with the women that were taking care of her, and how important that is for all the reasons that you can imagine.
Yeah, this is an area, and I'm actually going to be working on an article that touches on this in the next couple of days. It won't publish for 2 or 3 weeks, but I have been in several conversations. Some of it came out of the Life Enrichment virtual conference that we just finished, where frontline workers feel like management is not listening to them, and what I've heard from the management side is that they see the frontline workers as being a bit more rebellious because they have the frontline workers realize that the managers really need them, and so they're sort of flexing their muscle, and the management people don't like that very much. And yet I kind of think that's a good thing, because I think it creates an opportunity to make everything better for everybody.
Yeah, I you know what I think. Bottom line is, I think it comes down to respect.
Yeah. It does.
And understanding and empathy and listening, because you need it on all directions, because I'm not sure that the residents understand the challenge that it might have taken someone to get to work today, or the fact that they had 3 kids and they had to get them off to school and all of that. And I'm not sure that from the resident point of view that they really understand who their customer is, in sense of, well, they grew up, this is the stuff that's important to them. And I'm not sure leadership understands all of it either. So
yeah,
I think communication, conversation, talking, listening, interpretation, doing it all again and again would go some distance.
That's right. Well, Beth, thank you very much. If you're not subscribed, you should go to the National Invest. Give it to me, Rye.
I'll just say www.nic.org, and there's tons of information out there that we're putting out there for free in terms of ideas to think about and conversations to have with each other.
That's right. And run 2 of the greatest conferences in the industry. So, Beth, thank you very much for taking the time to share your wisdom and unpack these numbers. And with that, I am going to say goodbye, and we will be back next week with another great.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening.